Hi, everybody. Welcome to City Club. Can everybody hear me there in the back? Okay, great. Well, welcome this afternoon. My name is Forrest Longman. I am the current board president of City Club. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage our community and strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We begin each meeting by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued with the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people, and it has been this way since time immemorial. As always, I'd like to thank all our volunteers who make our programs possible. If you know of others who couldn't attend today's program, you can let them know that our program should be available to view on our website beginning next week. I'd also like to thank all of our sponsors for support. Those are Peace Health St. Joseph Medical Center, Bruce and Claudia Dyson, Danny Neal, real estate broker of the Moya Group, the Firehouse Arts and Events Center, Colshan CPAs, the Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, the Whatcom Community Foundation, and a big thanks to our caterer today, Calypso Kitchen. Our next program in March will be live from Bellingham, Washington. It's theater, comedy, and music. The panelists will be John Purdy of the Mount Baker Theater, Holly Huffman, owner of the Shakedown, and Michael Haycock of the Uprug Theater. They'll join us to celebrate live performances in Bellingham and dive into what sharing a live performance means for our mental health and our community. I'd like finally to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones. And finally, I'll introduce our moderator for today's program, Amy Nelson.
Thank you, Forrest. So good to see this group here for this program on fishing in all the usual and accustomed places. Those 8 words in the 1855 treaties with Washington tribes changed the fishing industry in the Northwest and continue to be consequential in decisions that have placed limits on heavy industry and development. The Bolt decision, named after U.S. District Court Judge George Bolt, brought about far-reaching societal changes as it reinforced tribal sovereignty and began to remedy centuries of racial injustice. Judge Bolt's decision, along with subsequent cases, confirmed that the 20 treaty tribes had the right to harvest half of the catch in Puget Sound in all of their traditional fishing areas. But perhaps even more importantly, as the water wars heat up, tribes are entitled to harvestable fish and a habitat that produces them. Our speakers will explain the history of this momentous decision and its effects that are still resonating in our land and water use planning today. They will explore the politics and challenges behind the Bolt decision and bring us up to date on the present state of the harvest. Our speakers are Elisa Pusholosia, was I close? Wilson, a member of the Lummi Indian Business Council and vice chair of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. She also serves as co-chair of the Natural Resources Committee of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians and is the former Endangered Species Act manager of the Lummi Natural Resources. She earned her bachelor's degree in Native Environmental Science from Northwest Indian College and created the documentary Time Immemorial, A Fishing History of the Lummi People, as her capstone project. Her expertise lies in treaty protection and fisheries policy management. Our second speaker is Dan Raas. He started his Indian law career in 1973 when he and his late wife moved to the Washington coast, where he represented the Quinault Indian Nation. In 1976, he was recruited by the Lummi Nation as its first reservation attorney. After representing the Lummi Nation for 39 years, concentrating on natural resources, taxation, and general government, he retired, although he still serves as the Chief Justice of the Tulalip Tribal Court of Appeals. He was a founding trustee and later chair of the Indian Law Section of the Washington State Bar Association. Locally, he's been president of the Whatcom County Bar Association, founding trustee and later chair of what is now Law Advocates, and the recipient of both the State and Whatcom County Bar Association's Pro Bono Lawyer of the Year awards. He graduated from the New York University School of Law as a Roots Tilden Scholar and earned a BA from Reed College. He's a charter member and past president of the club and currently a member of the program committee. So these are the right people to be before us today, and really looking forward to hearing from them. Lisa, let's see, I guess we have Dan's slides up first, so Dan will start.
Yeah. Hi everyone. It's interesting to be behind this mic instead of that one. But I'm pleased to be here, and I'm going to start out today because I'll cover the legal history, and then Lisa will talk. Lisa will talk about the, thank you. Lisa will talk about what the tribes are doing, what they can do, and moving forward, what kind of policies are being implemented. So, the Bolt decision, which was decided in February 12th of 1974, sparked a major change in fisheries and fisheries policy. It's still going, it's still an active case in the Western District of Washington. I'm not going to attempt to cover everything because I have 25 minutes and that would take most of the afternoon, but I'm going to hit some highlights. Thank you. Please make sure that you come, let me know when that happens. Because number one, I have a soft voice, and number two, I'm afraid of microphones. So, the two parts that I want to focus on and have you leave with is that there's a geographical limit to where the tribes can fish. It's the all usual and accustomed fishing grounds and stations. And the second thing is that the treaty includes a right to a habitat that produces harvestable fish. That just paper fish that are there on paper, or museum fish that satisfy the Endangered Species Act, are not what the treaty requires. So back before there was recorded European contact, say the 1790s, the tribes were not tribes as they are today, or as the U.S. understood tribes. There were mostly family groupings. They had a seasonal round of gathering resources. You went where your family was. The reason for that was because the fish run in your home area might fail, so you needed lots of friends around, lots of kin around. So it was a totally unknown culture and economic, if you will, process that the U.S. came and started to work with. In the late 1840s, early 1850s, the United States, you may revere him or not, but President Polk decided that he needed to make a lot of treaties. Treaties were easier than wars. So he commissioned who was then Colonel Isaac Stevens in the U.S. Corps of Engineers to do two things. One was to conduct a railroad survey, to survey a route for a railroad to the northwest, and while he was there to make contact with and discuss with the local Indian tribes. So later in 1854, Stevens was appointed the chief Indian agent and came back and together with his treaty commission, which included men who had been in the area for a long time, principally a man named George Gibbs, who wrote actually most of the treaties, went to the tribes and said, we would like to meet with you to have a treaty. The tribes were fully aware of what was going on. And the treaties were called around Puget Sound. The treaty for this part was the Treaty of Point Elliott, which is essentially Mukilteo these days. Treaty was a 3-day treaty conference, 1920, 21st of January, 1855. 2,500 tribal members showed up on treaty grounds. It was a very cold winter. Not all the tribes were able to make it. The Nooksacks, for example, were unable to come down the river because of ice. but 2,500 people are showing up. Stevens held 5 regional meetings. He had already leaked the contents of the treaties, of course. Thank you. You're catching up with me. No, I'm on the slide before that, actually. Stevens had already told the tribal people what the treaties would say or what he wanted them to say. There are extensive minutes of the treaty negotiations, which were kept in English and were related to most of the tribal people in a language called Chinook jargon, which is a trade language of about 1,500 to 2,000 words, which is not enough to convey the sophisticated words that the English treaties were. What resulted were what are now called the Stevens treaties. And we're going to talk about, in particular, the 5 Stevens treaties that dealt with Puget Sound and the waters of Puget Sound. So the treaty is set up, it's actually a deed. The first thing that the treaty says is, here's who's here. The United States represented by the Treaty Commission and a list of tribal groups, which may or may not have been how the tribal members would have described themselves. But certainly the treaty commissioners tried to get everybody named as possible. For example, the Nooksacks, this shows preparation. Nooksacks are listed, but they weren't there because of the weather. The next thing that happens is that there's a land cession. So the tribes hereby cede all right, title, and interest in the lands from the Cascade Crest to the salt water, except for those reservations that are set out below. And that's exactly what the U.S. wanted. As a matter of law, they wanted to clear title to the land. The next thing comes to tribal reserved rights. So the tribes' reserved rights, the big one is the big one for today certainly is the fishing right. The right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is hereby reserved to said Indians. Remember, we said who said Indians are. In common with all citizens of the territory, provided that they shall not take shellfish from beds staked and cultivated by citizens. That shellfish proviso we'll get to in a little while. But what Judge Bolt was concerned with was, what's the right of taking fish in all usual and accustomed fish areas? Or as it's abbreviated, UNA. So, before Judge Bolt's case, which was filed in 1970, there were, next slide please, there were four U.S. Supreme Court cases construing these 26 words or so. First, United States versus Winans, which concerned a state licensed fish wheel. Think of a mill wheel that just scoops up the fish down on the Columbia River, exactly where the Indian people all had traditional fisheries at Celilo Falls on the Columbia. And the state of Washington had licensed that fish wheel, and it's stopped all the Indians from fishing. The United States, on behalf of the tribes, brought suit. The United States Supreme Court said the treaty reserves those rights to fish. All usual and accustomed areas certainly include Celilo Falls, which is a famous fishery. And therefore, the state of Washington, your license is void. Now, the aftermath is not so good. You can read about it if you want, but that's the law. The next case, in 1916, was United States versus Suffolk Brothers. The treaties don't talk about the states of Washington because the only state around was Oregon. The Suffolk Brothers had a fish trap on the Oregon side of Celilo Falls. And the United States brought suit. The Supreme Court held that the treaties said all usual and accustomed fishing areas, even though they're outside the treaty area and even though they may be in a separate state. Next up was Thule versus Washington. Samson Thule is a Yakima fisher. State of Washington arrested him for fishing without a license, without a state license. Samson Thule said, wait a minute, I have a treaty right. And the Supreme Court said, that's right, the state cannot tax and cannot require the tribal members to pay for the right to fish. And the last one was Puyallup Tribe versus Washington Department of Game. This concerned steelhead, which at the time were regulated by the State Department of Game, not the State Department of Fisheries. And what happened was that the Game Department had started to attack Indians who were using nets to harvest steelhead. Steelhead were game fish and were only allowed to be harvested by hook and line, and in particular by sportsmen. That led to a whole series of fish-ins, at the end of one of which the railroad bridge over the Puyallup River was burned. But Puyallup won, this is because there are two more Puyallup cases, held that the tribes had a treaty right to fish. They had a treaty right to fish with nets on steelhead, but they couldn't chase the last living steelhead into their nets, which the Puyallup tribe had stipulated they had the right to do. But Supreme Court said, nope, you don't. So in 1970, the case was filed, U.S. versus Washington. Originally, there were 8 tribes that intervened as co-plaintiffs. That grew to 13 in the 1974 trial. And Judge Bolt held what was then the longest trial, and the longest civil trial in the Western District of Washington. He's very proud of that. He pioneered the use of something called the Manual for Complex Litigation, and this was complex litigation. And at the end, on February 12th, 1974, he issued a decision. The first 4 of these points are the important ones, the major ones. We'll get to all the rest of that stuff in a little while. First, the treaties are binding on the state of Washington and upon the United States. You would have thought 4 Supreme Court cases was enough, but no. Second, the collective tribal UNA includes all of the salt water in Puget Sound, all the fresh water draining into that salt water, and all the salt water offshore and Grays Harbor up to the Canadian border. At the time, that was federal. There was a time of the 12-mile limit. It was widely assumed when the 200-mile limit came in later that extended out tribal UNA, if you could prove you were actually fishing that far out in the salt water. Thirdly, the tribes were entitled to 50% of the harvestable fish that went through their UNA. They were catching 2% at the time and being harassed for it. And fourthly, when the tribes achieved appropriate technological and enforcement capacity, biologists and fish cops, then they could manage their own fisheries, separate and apart from what the state was doing. Now, when some of the tribes intervened in the case back in 1970, including the Lummies, the Makah, and the Quileute, they also said, as part of their complaint, we have a habitat right that produces harvestable fish. Judge Bolt severed that trial. He said, first let's see if you have a right at all, and then we'll get to phase 2, which is what the habitat right is called. So shortly after that, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed in 1975. The Supreme Court denied review in 1976, and the state of Washington began massive civil disobedience. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals characterized it later as, apart from some incidences in the civil rights area in the South, this represents the largest state and private resistance to a federal court order in the history of the United States. And it includes the decision by the state Supreme Court that Washington's Constitution prohibited it from enforcing the federal law. That may have some echoes. That was challenged, the whole thing was challenged, and the case in the Supreme Court is called Washington State Passenger Fishing Vessel Association versus State of Washington Passenger Fishing Association was the trawlers and the charter boat people. It's important because their president at the time was a man named Phil Anderson. The Supreme Court affirmed that decision, affirmed Judge Bolt's decision in 1979 by a 6-3 majority. So what happened after that? Well, as said, eventually up to 20 tribes joined the case. There was a decision that said fish or fish, any free swimming fish. In particular, herring was at stake. There used to be, believe it or not, a major herring fishery up at Cherry Point and also in Hales Pass. And once again, 50% was determined on a stream-by-stream, species-by-species basis. So it's not enough that the tribes collectively harvest 50% of the fish. Each tribe is entitled to catch 50% of the harvestable fish within those runs, stream by stream, species by species. This is the Blue Book. This is volume 1. This is my working copy, which is why it is a little ragged. All of the decisions between 1974 and 1985 are collected in volume 1, 1985 to 2004, I think it is, are in volume 2. And if you're going to work in this area, you have to have that, copies of this book, because not all of the decisions are published. So what happened in 1980, roughly? Beginning in 1980, the State Department of Fisheries decided they were not getting where they wanted with this constant fight. And the tribes, having already formed the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, also began to feel, well, maybe there's a better way to do this than fighting the state all the time. So they began what is now the cooperative management that we have today. The cooperation is called co-management between the state and the tribes. And the process starts just about now with the decisions of the Pacific Salmon Commission, which covers salmon fishing from Alaska down through British Columbia, down to Oregon and Washington, and then eventually goes to what's called north of Falcon, because the state of Washington and the tribes agree on harvest levels for Washington, but then that, and then there are specific seasons set. Now, what does all usual and custom fishing areas mean? First, tribes are entitled to protect their UNA from development, and that was first held in the mid-1980s when the Elliott Bay Marina received a Corps permit from the Corps of Engineers to expand the Elliott Bay Marina, which would have deprived the Muckleshoot and Suquamish tribes of substantial fishing area right outside of the Ballard Locks when it hits the salt water. And the Muckleshoot and Suquamish sued the Corps of Engineers. Corps of Engineers lost. And the district court in Seattle said, no, UNA means UNA, all UNA means all UNA. You can't diminish tribal UNA without an act of Congress because it's a treaty right, or the agreement of the tribes. The tribes eventually, Muckleshoot and Suquamish eventually worked out a deal, and if you go down to Ray's Boathouse, you can look at the Elliott Bay Marina. Some of the time, you can actually see people fishing with nets. That was driven home with a Lummi case, Northwest Sea Farms versus Corps of Engineers. in the early 2000s, Northwest Sea Farms proposed to put a series of net pens on the southwest side of Lummi Island, which is right in the way of an active fishing site that Lummi has. The Corps of Engineers, relying on the Elliott Bay Marina case, denied it. And Northwest Sea Farms sued. The district court once again said, no, even though it's less than 0.1% of Lummi UNA, you can't diminish the geographic scope of a tribe's UNA without an act of Congress or the tribe itself. In 1993, we talked about the shellfish case. Remember, there's a shellfish proviso. The court held that fish are fish. All modern species are included at all depths, which means that there may not be as many little red clams left, but the clams and cockles that are there now are part of the treaty right. Natural oysters were all the Olympias. Oh, they've been replaced by a lot of Japanese oysters, part of the treaty right. There was no dive fishery for sea cucumbers. In 1855, there's a thriving dive fishery now, part of the treaty right. 50% included all the shellfish in state and federal waters and on state and federal tidelands. But shellfish farmers like Taylor Shellfish, whose beds were farmed prior to 1995, need only share the natural production of those beds, which in point of practice means they're not sharing anything, because how do you measure what's the natural production when you've had a shellfish farm on those beds forever? So, remember we had phase 2, got deferred. In 1985, the Court of Appeals, Ninth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals, said, well, we think there probably is a habitat right, but tribes, you didn't prove your case. So we're going to vacate the district court decision. And from then till about 1999, every tribe was scrambling to try and find what's a good phase 2 case. The fisheries director at Lummi would call me every few weeks and say, I've got a phase 2 case. And we'd look at it and look through it and decide, no, it wasn't going to qualify. Finally, with the help of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, we decided on culverts. And the major reason we decided on culverts is because the state had done a study in 1996. The State Highway Department had asked the State Fisheries Department, how many fish are we really killing with our culverts? And the answer was 200,000 adult fish. Now granted, that was statewide, but most of those fish are in the western part of the state. So that was the impetus, and as well, that was the major evidentiary point, even though the trial took three weeks. That was a major evidentiary point that the tribes brought in the culvert case. So initially, the position of the tribes was, you have to fix all the culverts. The state said, we can't do that, actually. It's not impossible, but it sure is impractical. So the court ordered the state to fix culverts that block 80% of the habitat by 2030, which the state estimated at time of trial, which was, time of decision was 2013, would cost about $2 billion. But they had 17 years to do it. Well, thanks to all of the various federal programs, they're on track again to actually fix those culverts, much to the annoyance of those of us who drive on state highways. Now, you may note that that's state highways, not county and city roads. There are a lot of fish blocking culverts that are owned by the states and the counties. Some counties, like Whatcom County, and some cities, like Bellingham, said, oh, we can see that already on this wall. and started fixing their culverts. Some counties like Skagit didn't. So as a summary, the tribal UNA, usual and accustomed fishing areas, may not be diminished save by act of Congress or tribal agreement. And secondly, the tribal right to fish includes a habitat that will produce harvestable fish. So, I think I'm out of time, but if you were more interested, there are two things you can look for. One is the documentary called Fish War, filmed by the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, which premiered 2 weeks ago at the Bolded 50 celebration held at Institute. And Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission will make that available. The second is a book by Charles Wilkinson, who was involved in the original trial and worked as a professor of law at the University of Colorado Boulder, and a tribal advocate for years and years and years and years and years and years. And that book is called Treaty Justice, and I believe it's for sale up at the counter on your way out, right? Yep, she says it right. So, also Linda Mapes has a much more repertorial. Linda Mapes is a longtime reporter for the Seattle Times. She has a book coming out about the primarily centered around the dam removal of the Elwha River, which has a 20-year fight. And you might note that a dam can also be defined as a culvert surrounded by a whole lot of cement.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. So next we'll hear from Lisa. And be thinking of questions, because there will be time for questions from the audience this afternoon.
See. It's on. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Asiem, Nostalgia Siem, Quashilosia, Son of Snat, Lisa Wilson, Son of Snat. Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Lisa Wilson. My traditional name is Quashilosia, and that is named after my grandmother Sarah. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit of my history. Is that I started fishing the year before the Judge Bolt decision, and I fished through those years with my father, Rusty Wilson, and just even being at the harbor right now brings back so many memories of, being young and going out and just really learning how to be a strong person, because, being a fisherman has really planted the seed, and also with my father instilling in me how important that Judge Bolt decision was, and why we needed to stand up for those promises that were made for our people. And so throughout my life, that's stuck with me. And about 10 years ago, I started working for Lummi Natural Resources, and I also started going to the Northwest Indian College. And I always have to acknowledge the ancestors that were here, the ones that did get into that canoe in the dead of winter, January 22nd, 1855, and paddle all the way down to Mukilteo to make sure that they reserve those rights that we have today. And so that's why I feel like it's my obligation to make sure that I do pick up that work and move forward. Most recently, a late mentor of mine, the late Randy Kinley Sr., he is the one that I worked with when I first started with Natural Resources. And I also have to acknowledge Alan Chapman, who's back here, that in all the years that he's worked, he hasn't given up that work. And it's just like the same thing that our people do. It's not a job, it's who we are, and that's why it means so much to us. That's why we feel so passionate about it. It's not just a job. And so I just really want to commemorate, Alan, that still is out here fighting and making sure that, things definitely don't go the way that they should. And I definitely can feel his frustration. I also really want to thank Dan, who was there at the forefront of a lot of different cases and protecting our treaty rights. And so that's why I was really passionate about when I started at the Northwest Indian College and was learning about Billy Frank Jr. And then I was thinking about, well, where are where is our history of our people? Because I knew that we had come from strong people, and so that's why I had that desire to make that documentary so that our people would know our history. Because in order to know where you're going, you need to know where you come from, and so that's why it is just so important that I've invited. Our one of our young tribal members, Santana Rabang, she's already done a lot of work with Daryl Hilaire, and just passing down that knowledge, because she is the future, the one that I'm passing the baton to after this. And it is definitely not easy work, and I knew that the late Randy had carried so much on his shoulders because he felt it so deeply, and trying to wake everybody up to what's really happening here, because we've lost so much, and everything over these years has been off the backs of our people and the tribe, as far as losing that habitat and losing those runs that we once had. It was stated that salmon is as important as the air that we breathe, and that when the tide is out, the table is set. And so that's why it is so important to us. And when the treaty was signed, the salmon weren't as important because there was no way to preserve them at the time. And then once canning was invented, it just became this big commodity. And one thing that I would like to mention is so it always states about the Winans case being the first case, but before that Winans case, there was the Alaska Packers case, and that was where we had our reef nets, but they were being blocked. And so what I think about my ancestors of not knowing the language which was spoken, but to actually, learn that language, but then actually learn the court systems and actually be able to actually have victories in those, is because it's not as easy as just, it feels like we don't start up here, we have to start down here and do all the extra work just to get up to where we need to be. And so for my ancestors to have that foresight to start that first case, the Alaska Packers, with Judge Hanford, and at the time Judge Hanford said, well, we employ so much of your people that it would really and there's so much fish out here, there's enough for everybody, that it would do more damage to you if we took those traps down. And so anyways, so that's why I just want to acknowledge that. But then after all of the different court cases that led up to the Judge Bolt decision, and then after that with the co-management, it was Merle Jefferson, our fisheries director. He's still working as well. He's getting into his late 70s, and he's still at the forefront fighting, but and so he was a big part of that culvert decision. So after this culvert decision and about the habitat that's been degraded for many years, what we have at Lummi that we've been really focusing on these last 10 to 15 years is our hatcheries, because unfortunately that's all that we have left. We definitely would prefer the natural runs that we had, but we just don't have those anymore. And so the foresight of the late Randy Kinley is, he's the one that said we really need to ramp that up. But The problem is that they cut the production down extremely unilaterally without, co-management. And then also the resources, there's just not a lot of resources. So, Dan talked about the North of Falcon process, and we're in it right now where, the tribes work with the states as co-managers and figure out, through escapements of what we can catch and can't fish or can't catch. And one of the myths out there is that the reason why we don't have any fish is it's because it's our nets across the river. And even like, so when you look at it, when, the fish are being caught all the way from Alaska, all the way down, and this has been used against us many a times, is that once the fish get into the river, and then the spotlight is turned on us, and it's gotta be you guys and your nets across the river why we don't have any salmon. Well, in this North of Falcon process, we actually divvy down we even, like some of the tribes have to split like fish in half to catch. And so we definitely, and there's a lot of myths that if we just stopped fishing, if you just stop eating salmon, then everything is fine. And that's just not true. We live it, so we know exactly what is happening. And so through these hatcheries, we put this big effort to ramp them up. And so in 2015, we had like 9 South Fork Chinook. And then and so through this North of Falcon process, it's just a way that we felt like it was riding the harvest down to zero. So whatever you focus on is going to manifest. And so we decided that we were going to really concentrate on bringing our salmon back. And so we created a 10-year plan with our, tribes, the Nooksack tribe, and then we also worked with WGF&W, and we created this, plan of when did we have harvestable fish, and so it was like the mid-'80s, and so that's what we decided to do, was to concentrate on building those fish back up from, the harvestable levels in the mid-'80s. Well, we actually were able to accomplish bringing those 9 salmon back from 2015 to a couple of years ago. We brought those stocks back up to 3,000. So we showed that we could bring the salmon back, but the problem is that we lost over 2,500 of those salmon. And it just shows that our habitat cannot sustain the salmon because it's degraded, and then you bring in, that's the year that we had the heat dome. And so climate change is definitely compacting that. We don't want to say it's all climate change because we know we don't want to let the habitat off the hook. And so with that phase 2 that we're talking about is we don't have that habitat right now. So what does that look like? Well, the resources to get to us to fixing that habitat is we're in a process where we have to compete against dollars, against stakeholders. When it's our treaty right, we are putting those processes that are diminishing those rights. Once we actually do fare out of that process, then we've got all of this bureaucracy that's been created that impacts getting us to recovery. You've got these permits for the hatchery that hold our hatcheries to a higher standard than wastewater treatment plants. We have to jump through more hoops than the state does with their hatcheries. That's one area on the hatcheries. On the habitat side, with the FEMA no rise, it's called Clomer-Lomer, is like we have to go through the same permitting processes that the developers do to degrade the habitat than it does to fix the habitat. And so as you can see, the system is broken of how we get to recovery. And so what we need to do is, because the tribes are doing all the work, here these fish were promised to us, but we're the ones bringing the salmon back. We're the one fixing the habitat, a problem we didn't create. So basically we're upholding the treaty obligations to ourselves. And the thing is, and if it wasn't for these treaty rights, there wouldn't be any salmon because there wouldn't have been all of these protections all of these years. So, I just wanted to kind of give some background of, what the tribes are doing. They're basically doing everything with everything stacked against us. And so that's why, I want to make sure that people know exactly what's happening, and educate as much as I can to show, the fight that we've been in. And I always talk about, how Randy, I started to follow him around to the meetings before he passed away. And it's something that Alan just talked to me about when I talked to him earlier is, I just always saw the stress on his face. And, I just said, well, because everything just looks so bleak. I was just like, well, how do you deal with this when it just doesn't seem like it's very hopeful? And he said, well, if we quit, then they win. And, so it's like, well, the thought is like, if we quit, then there's definitely no hope. But if we keep trying with everything that we have, then at least we still have hope. And so taking a look at the bigger picture of what I've been working on the last couple of years is that, first of all, getting the money streamlined to the tribes so we can just get the work done, because a lot of problems that we have are grants that really bog us down and take a lot of capacity away. And then the other part of that is, going to Washington, D.C., meeting with EPA, meeting with FEMA, letting them know what our issues are, and we were actually working on an executive order, a request from Biden to put somebody in charge of our federal trustees, because they should be protecting our treaty rights, but the majority is when they come to us, they come at us as regulators. So they're regulating our hatcheries, and then they're regulating our harvest, so literally tying both of our hands behind our backs. And so what we're trying to do with this executive order is put somebody in charge of our trustees to make them be our trustees and not our regulators. And so we didn't quite get the finish line yet. There's still a bit of time to do that, but he did roll out an executive order, and that was taking a look at getting the money to the tribes to do the work, and then also looking at those regulations. And so with that executive order, we're going to request a formal government to government and ask for those waivers. But if we don't get that waiver, then it might, lead to another court case, because we've tried to work all avenues. It's not like we just want to go and put that out there and go through this. We try to work out as much as we can. But when we've done absolutely everything in our power and it's still not getting us to where we need to be, then we've got to look at those other avenues. And so one good news from last year is this IRA funding. NOAA was going to just roll it out in those other systems that I told you where we have to compete against stakeholders. Well, we found out and brought a group of tribal leaders to meet with the Biden staff, reached out to Senator Cantwell because she's the one that put the money in to make sure that we were going to get it, and then NOAA just disregarded the tribes for consultation or consideration. Then reached out to the Secretary of Commerce, went back to DC, met with the Secretary, told her about our salmon that were dying on our grounds, that it's been stated that by the year 2050, if we don't do something different, then our salmon could go extinct. And then she put her hand on mine and she said, we won't let that happen. We went back one more time with the tribal leaders, and then at the end of the day, between us and the Columbia River tribes, they secured $300 million going directly to our hatcheries through our self-governance compacts. So we feel like, that we've got to change that at the highest levels, because we're not getting to it down here. And so that's why, we feel like if treaties are the supreme law of the land, then we need to be up here with the feds, but we also need to be up here with the co-managers. And so another area that I've been working on is the relationship with the WDF&W Commission. And that's been a little bit rocky, educating them on our hatchery science. we've got a few different commissioners that don't seem to want to, that do not respect the treaty rights or do not want to really work with us. And so that's very concerning, but we did actually pass the first ever state co-manager hatchery policy last October. We've been working on that for about 5 or 6 years, with the understanding that we would start working together on an overall salmon recovery plan, because it's so many different silos that we're working in. Everybody, the governor has his salmon recovery plan, Department of Natural Resources. So, and then you got it's just, there's nothing that's connecting. And so what we talked about is with this co-manager policy that we would move forward and take a look at all of the areas, not just harvest, but the overall plan of what that looks like and what we need to get to salmon recovery. Because the system that we're in right now has been going on for about 30 years and it's not getting us to recovery. And like I said, the system that have been working through, we're never going to get there with everything that's been stacked against us. So we've got to do something different. And so I just really wanted to paint that picture for you all of what we're dealing with and what we're up against. And I just thank you for listening. Haichka.
If I might supplement what Lisa said in 2 areas. First, I mentioned Phil Anderson, who was the president of the Passenger Fishing Vessel Association. He has been quoted widely, and if you watch Fishboy, you'll hear him directly, that without the Bolt decision, we would have no salmon in Western Washington, because there'd be nobody to speak up for them. Secondly, with respect to the tribes destroying the resource, I want to quote Judge Bolt in footnote 26. See, that's why breathing takes so long. With a single possible exception testified to by a highly interested witness and not otherwise substantiated, notwithstanding 3 years of exhaustive trial preparation, neither game nor fisheries has discovered and produced any credible evidence showing any instance, remote or recent, when a definitely identified member of any plaintiff tribe exercised his off-reservation treaty rights by any conduct or means detrimental to the perpetuation of any species of anadromous fish. So that's 50 years ago, and the lie still lives.
Well, thank you both for the information that possibly could clear things up in the minds of people in our room, and maybe we can take that knowledge forward and to be part of the solution as well. Thank you, Lisa, for that very, very clear description of what challenges our faces. It's my heart is with you. It's an important struggle, I'm sure. Does anybody have a burning question off the top? I have a whole list full, but I see someone over here.
And I've got the microphone right here, so we'll start right here on the steps.
I'm lucky.
My question is about local government. My name is Atul. I'm a beauty commissioner and a county planning commissioner. So I'm curious to hear from both of you. What are your thoughts about what local government can do, the PUD, the port, the city, and the county? One observation that I have is when I spent time with Merle Jefferson shortly after I got elected, one of the things I recalled was how many people at the Lummi Nation work in natural resources. It was like 60 at that time. And then I came back and looked at all the other local governments, and maybe got half a dozen people that work in natural resources collected. So that's something I wonder about. But I speak to it however you'd like to. What do you think local government can do?
Well, I'm sure Alan can handle this question a lot better than I can, but, we do work within local as well. We definitely have different agreements, but we have the WIRA one, and so that's the thing is, we might have 60, well, probably, I think close to 80 now, employees, But it still isn't enough because there's so many different issues that come at us, just like a fire hose. And so there's definitely a lot of different things that can be done, and we have definitely collaborated and got support, not just on salmon issues. Just recently when I was in DC, we had Barry Buchanan and Kaylee Galloway, and because and this is another thing too, is, this fentanyl crisis that we're in, it's like, it's very sad. We've lost so many different community members, especially young community members. We're losing a whole generation, it seems like, and it has always been stated that what happens to the salmon happens to our people, and we know that we're not being able to hand down that way of life like we used to, and so I do feel like it has taken a big toll on our people. And so there's been different things like, and that's the thing too, is because it feels like we're taking, all of the hits, and then when it's time, and it is a lot about political will. I guess the example is, we've got all these reds on the Nooksack, and so we had proposed a tubing ban. And even some of the county councilors kind of started that mentality, like, if you guys are so worried, why don't you just take your nets out of the river, kind of thing. And but we finally this year did get that tubing ban. But it is kind of like, yeah, what can the overall society do, and how can our governments get them on board? And that's, like I said, in different areas. We definitely work with local. We have to work with everyone, and so that's why we need such capacity, because we are working on the local, state, and federal levels. I don't know if you have something to add to that.
No.
Hi, Jim Douglas. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really informative, but boy, things are so complex. I want to ask, particularly Lisa, but either of you can comment on this. The state requires now that by 2025, all counties and cities update their comprehensive plans. Now, you've talked about habitat, and clearly habitat is impacted by land use decisions, and that is what those comp plans are largely about. I mean, there are other things too. So how do you see the tribal groups and others interested in the fisheries impacting those updated comp plans? How are you involving yourself in that process? And as a sovereign nation, do you have any trump card on those things?
I'll start. That's a really good example of where tribes need allies. And Merle may have 80 employees, but that's still not enough to cover all the bases. And working with the comp plan amendments is a classic example of where the tribes become just one voice at the table among dozens of others. And if the local governments won't take some of that initiative and say, for example, no longer will people be allowed to tube down the Nooksack, that when salmon are nesting, that's red as a salmon nest. Tribes don't have the resources to bird dog everything. The end result may well be a lawsuit, and lawsuits are expensive, and they tend to polarize people, as I think Lisa will tell you, and Merle for sure, and Alan Chapman as well. Tribes would rather negotiate the matters and get them done than sue.
Yeah, and as far as, we're up against this all the time, where the outside comes with their agendas and they need to get it done right away, and we're supposed to just be in there and kind of conform and get into it. But that's the thing where we also have to make sure that whatever those, because that's one of the issues today, is that the process that is set up is being processed to death. Like, they've created so many different processes that we don't even have the capacity to attend all of the different committees, because it just seems to be, creating another group or creating another document, and it's just not getting us anywhere. And so that's one of the main problems that we have, is that, I feel like if it's some kind of comprehensive plan, but it does have to, we have to kind of, it depends on the group, because what we're doing right now is some of the processes where they're talking about plans that will actually be, it's got to be on the co-manager level, because we do have our co-managers, and then ultimately, NOAA is above us. And so we've got to make sure that we are in those processes, like I said before, of getting us up here and not down here, because that's where they just kind of keep us busy down here, and it's just that definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We're not getting there where what we're doing today.
Other questions?
Hi, I was just wondering what the average citizen can do to help out.
Well, so and that's one of the things, that's why, when I do get asked to have an opportunity to educate, like this room here, now when people come and, say, oh, those Indians and their nets across the river, you could say, well, actually, they manage down to the fish, they're bringing the salmon back, if it wasn't for them, then we wouldn't have salmon, kind of. So I think a lot of it is education that we have to do about exactly what the problem is. Because then you get like these third parties that, disguise themselves, they're like NGOs, but they're basically litigators that are anti-hatchery, and they're gonna come try to shut every hatchery down. That's what we're up against as well. So we need advocacy on those ends, as far as, because and part of that too, of the phase 2, the habitat, is that hatchery fish have been deemed a treaty fish. So you've got these people with their biased science that say hatchery fish are bad, and so the next thing you know, they're attacking us on that. And so we, try to, do everything we can to make sure that those hatchery fish are just as important to us as the natural fish, because that's what we have left to use. And it's not about commercial at all. This is about ceremonial fish that we use for every funeral that we have. And we have had a lot of funerals. We sometimes have 2 and 3, 4 funerals a week. And so it's not about the industry part of it, it's just saving what's left of our culture. We put salmon in the freezer for our Stomish, or we have it on hand for memorials, whatever. And so that's basically what we're doing. And so I guess the average person could, just carry that message, but, definitely, we do need allies for sure, because, we have been asked by the Alaska tribes that have been attacked by those same people, and also the Columbia River tribes, to start banding together, because, what they're doing is, it's basically killing our culture by, thinking that they've got this paternalistic, they know better. And like I said, we live it, so we actually know it. It's not just, science that's thrown out there. It's something that we've actually witnessed, so.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that the initial decision on phase 2 in 1985 also held in the tribe's favor. Hatchery fish were intended to replace the natural runs. Therefore, they are treaty fish, just like the natural fish. That's 1985 was almost, 40 years ago? Some people haven't figured that out. And when you hear, oh, hatchery fish are bad for the native runs, that may or may not be true. It doesn't matter as a matter of law. That tribes are entitled to those fish.
Hi, Phelps McElvain, I'm with NC.
I'm gonna read this briefly. A Seattle federal court judge recently found that each year NOAA fisheries authorized the Southeast Alaska Chinook salmon fishery, that they had broke the law by knowingly endangering the species they were charged with protecting. The number of fish that were caught by this group was 3% originated in Alaska, 97% were originated in BC, Washington, Oregon, and California. And the ruling was that the National Marine Fisheries Plan had to be stopped until they could come up with another plan that would indicate how the fish, for instance, for the Nooksack, would actually get back to the Nooksack. And for 3 days, the Troll Association was pulled off the water. And then they got a stay of the ruling. I was just wondering if you knew what the state of play of that decision was and how it could affect Whatcom County salmon in the future.
Well, it's my understanding the stay is still in effect until the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals rules. But that's the perfect example of the problems that the fishery faces and the tribes face. 97% of the southbound, lower BC, Washington, Oregon, and California Chinook salmon are caught in Alaska. And because of the political protection that Alaska has, Senator Stevens, while he was still alive and in office, now Senator Murkowski, Alaska has treated NOAA as their spokespeople and their regulators to guarantee that the Alaska troll fishery stays in full operation. Now, to be fair, a lot of those Alaska troll fishermen are from Washington and Oregon, and they have crew members who are from other states. But nonetheless, those are native and hatchery Chinook, which are caught in Alaska, which otherwise would come down to Puget Sound. And that's precisely the problem, or one of the problems.
You know, I'm Roger Granger. I grew up on Lummi Island right out there. I just turned 86. I've reefed it since I was 4 years old. And I'm amazed that so many people came to hear this. Dana Wilson was a former student of mine, and I see other former students here. Tell him hi for me. And I stopped in 3 times, talked to his mother-in-law, but I haven't got to talk to him yet. So tell him Mr. Granger said hi.
Will do.
I see other people here. A lot of people are interested, and I'm glad of that. I see NC's here. There's a whole group of fishermen who started NC. It had a different name. It still was NC. It was the Nooksack, Samish, and Hensman Association. We had hatcheries all the way from the Blaine Old water system all the way down to Colony Creek. We had fish coming back. To every one of those, we embarrassed the state of Washington because it was all free money. And I see one other person, at least one other person here that worked on that project. All fishermen, all interested in bringing fish back. How many fish are being brought back by NC today? There's not one fisherman that I know of, commercial fishermen involved. We all quit. Because it went in a different direction. We embarrassed the state. The state of Washington is part of the great problem we've got. A huge problem. A huge problem that every tribe has.
Roger, excuse me, do you have a question in that?
I wanted to make a point clear. We had fish coming back. There are no fish being planted now, to my knowledge. And that's a disaster. My question is, why is it that way? Why did all the fishermen quit? Why did it turn to a different face? All these blue cones out here, all over the county, planting beside streams, that's great. But unless we put fish back in those streams, there will be none there. You and I, everybody in the state of Washington paid a whole bunch of money to put a a new culvert under the pole road. That is not a stream. That was a ditch dug by farmers. We're having money wasted on projects that don't produce any fish. We're talking about producing fish. Trying to.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's what I talked about, is the state unilaterally cutting that production. And that is, so, and some of the other issues that we've been facing is, the state and different people, the same groups that were, pushing for the gill net ban. We've been down at the legislature, they go after the non-tribals because that's where they can. But we know ultimately 50% of zero is zero, so that's why we stand up just as equally for non-tribal fishermen, because, we don't want to give up. We don't want to give up. We want to make sure, and that's why we actually started a hatchery coalition, mainly with recreational groups and charter groups that feel equally as strong about bringing these salmon back. It's a hatchery coalition that we have with Tulalip, Upper Skagit, and Squaxin, but we have the Puget Sound Anglers and Coho charters. We are lacking gill netters, but the gill netters are the ones that we've stuck up for to make sure that you continue fishing, because we don't want to take another salmon advocate off of the water. And that's also what we've done with this conservation policy that WDF&W has come out with. Because in their mind, if we just stop hatcheries and we just stop harvesting, then their world will be fine. And so that's why we've went up to bat to make sure that they're not taking any of our salmon people off the water, because we're all in it together.
Well, you're in your 80s, I'm 92. So I have the right to say something.
Yes. Okay.
First of all, I think everyone in this room needs to congratulate the Lummies for, it's because of them that we don't have the largest coal terminal in North America. Secondly, as I sat here and listened to us kind of interact with each other, I started on the work committee with Alan. Where's Alan? And I'm a member of the Citizens Committee for the Aquatic Reserve. And I've been involved in biotic surveys out here for a long time. Not this year because my health isn't what it used to be. But thank you for being the one who mentioned the climate crisis. Because we keep talking about all these people who are interacting and not involved with each other or hating each other or whatever. I remember the fish wars. Take a look at what's on your table. There's an elephant in the room, and that is that BP has just purchased Gulf Road, and it's kind of a surprise to a lot of us. Well, on our table, it's full of fossil fuels. I guess the thing is, I can tell you that I've got photographs of the small creatures out along the whole Cherry Point Reach. And the year we had the big hot spot in the Pacific, the pictures were off. And although our disasters have come back, the other ones haven't.
What's your question?
Pardon?
What's your question?
My question is, if we all look at our table and see it's full of fossil fuels, and we all drove here, what are we going to do about BP? we need to protect our environment. What do you recommend?
If I can sort of tap onto that question a bit, it's the Volt decision obviously denied the federal permit at Cherry Point. But what do we see as the future for that port, that deep water area and the land around that?
Well, it is, you know, we have a resolution of no new development at Cherry Point. You know, when it's the same kind of, what we have, this is the Army Corps of Engineers, is they have to, you know, come to the Lummi Nation. And so, we are using that right that we have to protect what's left, you know, because even though we don't own that land, we have, you know, it is sacred to us because, you know, our people have been buried there, and it's been a sacred, you know, land for a long time. But, you know, it is definitely a catch-22, you know, because we want to definitely move towards more green energy, but not at more cost of our treaty rights, you know, not at more cost of more vessel traffic. And so we have to kind of walk a fine line. You know, we own gas stations too, and that helps with the economy of our people. So how can we, you know, come together with the best of all worlds of what that looks like? Because, you know, we don't want to compromise our treaty rights, but we also need an economy for our people. And how do we move forward in the best way we can with the green energy? You know, you have the wind energy that's coming down the coast, and so we've got a lot of threats to our coastal tribes that, and the same thing about losing UNA to wind farms. And so those are different things that we definitely have been looking at, is, you know, that we're looking at, you know, hydrogen. I know that's a big, but the thing is for the majority of our people, you mentioned any development at Cherry Point, and that is like a bad word. You know, there's no development. We've actually made a strong statement, you know, because BP had said they purchased that land as a buffer. And so we basically stated that, you know, we will oppose any development that they do there, because that's just what we've promised our ancestors, that, you know, we will protect that at any cost. It has been stated that with the coal terminal, you know, not for any cost. And so we will definitely be there protecting, but what does that look like to transition into something that's better for us?
I would note that Lummi has been actively protecting the Cherry Point area in court from at least 1979, when the Chicago Bridge and Iron Company wanted to carve out part of the Cherry Point Bluff and build a graving dock to construct oil platforms. And Lummi was at the forefront of fighting that effort, and since then has not hesitated to say, don't do it or we'll sue you. And lately the Corps of Engineers has actually been paying attention.
Thank you for your questions, everyone. Amy, if you want to close out the program?
Yes, just to close out with a big thank you to all of you for coming and listening, and you too for your expertise and sharing this great education with us. And for City Club, next month, remember we have something on the other end of the spectrum of this discussion, but that will be about live performances, something that we all get a lot out of theater and that sort of thing. And in the meantime, we have lots and lots to think about. So thank you both for